Welcome to the Let's Talk Health Forum. I'm Dr. Dan Pavlik Jr. As we always are trying to bridge the alternative medical world with the traditional medical world. Today I'm here with a friend of mine and professional partner. This is Adrian Quevedo, and he works in the world of, I'll put it as simply as I can, brain mapping, and amongst other things. But he is with a company called Neurologics, and he's been doing, tell me about it. You've been doing brain mapping and neurofeedback for
26 years.
26 years. Man, you look too young to be, 26 years of that. But yeah, I'm very curious and interested, and I'm sure our audience is going to be very interested as far as what that world is like, and I'm glad you're here to explain it. So tell us a little bit about neurofeedback and your background and how you got into that.
Well, first of all, Dr. Pavlik, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
We have been friends for a long time, so we've talked about this quite a lot. A lot of good conversations back and forth about what this is. But basically, in a nutshell, Neurologics is a company that I started some time back. My professional experience started back 26 years ago, like I said. This was right at the infancy of brain mapping and neurofeedback. So when I was an undergrad at UCF, I had a neuropsych professor that taught a class, and within the class there was a section on brainwaves, and he wanted students to come and talk about brain mapping and what it was. And I went on a weekend and saw 19 lines going across the screen, and I knew that from that moment I wanted to know what every single one of those lines meant. And 26 years later, here I am talking to you about it. So it's been a pretty interesting journey so far.
Yeah, and it's never been boring because you've consistently had new ideas and new technology.
Oh,
and all this stuff.
I mean, we've learned just so much in 26 years. When I started, this was not very well known. It was started by a group of neuropsychologists back. We've known about this field since the 1960s. So it's been around much longer than I've been around, but I came in right when the technology had developed far enough to where the computing power was keeping up with the brain activity that was being, recorded. So looking at a brain map, which is our predominant assessment tool, we use it not for diagnostics per se, we use it for differential diagnostics. So what we're talking about is this looks like this looks like that. And so when we map a brain and we take a cap that has 19 sensors, we listen to brainwave activity and we digitize it and decode it in a way that allows us to look at each part of the brain as it's wired from a functional perspective. So frontal lobe of the brain, executive control, decision making, processing emotions, things like that. The temporal lobes are involved with speech and language. Further back we have the occipital lobes that are involved with visual processing. So all these things are encoded and decoded by the brain depending on its functionality. So if different parts of the brain are not working with others, the example I use is that if you have a perfectly clean gas tank with a rock solid engine and everything is really clean and works really well, but the gas lines are not connected, this engine doesn't work very well. So when we look at a brain map, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at what are the connections and the pathways that are working, what's not. And then we move into additional, things like assessing functional parts of the body from a metabolic perspective. We look at food sensitivities. We can look at all different levels in the gut for neurotransmitter production. We can even dig down into the DNA, which is a big area that I've been went in head first to this. It's mind-boggling what the DNA methylation pathways are doing. So we're integrating all that because brain mapping and neurofeedback has been around for a long time. It's been cross-validated against a lot of psychological test batteries for the purposes of assessing somebody for different conditions. Things match up really well. But at the same time, then the neurofeedback has done marvelous things in pediatrics. So one of the major things is attention deficit hyperactive disorder, the ADHD spectrum. So that's been a big area of mine that I've spent most of my time really diving in deep to what is ADHD from a functional perspective, not just symptomology. So that's essentially what Neurologics is our pursuit is to understanding the body in perspectives from all the way from the brain down to the gut and what those connections are.
Well, let's dive into that.
Yeah.
Basically, so, it's been around since the 1960s, you said,
Yeah,
correct?
60s, 70s, yeah.
And, you just explained the kind of the correlation between neurofeedback and there might be a little confusion with people with biofeedback and neurofeedback.
Yeah, great.
Can
I'm
you put
glad
that
you
much?
asked. Yeah, so neurofeedback is a type of biofeedback. So biofeedback, you can, hold a thermostat and change body temperature. You can regulate your breath. Heart rate variability is another form of biofeedback. EMG is another form of biofeedback that you can utilize. But neurofeedback is specific to the brain because we're giving the brain feedback about its performance. So in a neurofeedback session, after we've evaluated the brain and seen which areas are producing too much or not enough of a certain frequency that can have a direct effect to that specific location, then we put single leads and the participant will sit in front of a computer monitor and they'll just watch a movie. As they're watching the movie, when the brain patterns move towards baseline for their age and their sex and whatever we're trying to correct, when those patterns move into more normalized states, the screen will brighten. And if the brain produces patterns that are distressed, unfocused, distracted, or tense, the screen will get dark. And what happens is that over time, the brain learns how to control the brightness on the screen. And that's a form of what we call operant conditioning. You may remember classical conditioning with Pavlov, the dog, and salivation and the bell. Experimenter came into the room, the bell rang, and the dog assumed that it was getting food, so it salivated. That's a classical conditioning method. Operant conditioning introduces a negative stimulus. So essentially, I use car analogies a lot because they're understandable. Everyone drives a car. So if you get in your car and you drive off without buckling your seatbelt, the car will ding, ding, ding at you until you buckle your seatbelt. So what you've been operantly conditioned by the car companies is to buckle your seatbelt before you drive off by dinging that bell. So over time, what your brain figured out, it said, if I want to avoid that annoying dinging sound, I'm going to buckle my seatbelt before I even turn the key. So you've been conditioned operantly to avoid that dinging sound. The brain does the same thing with neurofeedback, where it's trying to avoid the dark screen by producing only the right patterns. And over time, the brain learns that. Very, very subconscious process. There's very little someone can do to influence it. It's not, I tell my kids that are doing neurofeedback, it's not Jedi mind tricks that you're playing on the computer. Your brain is literally being monitored and being rewarded for producing the correct patterns and being punished for producing the wrong patterns with that dark screen. Over time, the brain learns, oh, if I do this pattern, I get rewarded. Oh, I did it again. Let me do it longer. And then we set thresholds and just incrementally increase the difficulty so that the brain learns and it becomes easier and easier over time through a series of sessions how to keep that screen bright. So that's how the neurofeedback works.
So one of the main conditions that you treat is the attention deficit disorder in all different ages, and you can get into that here in a second. But tell me a little bit more about how you're diagnosing it. You said, you have a cap with all these sensors, and how long does that take? Like, what does that entail?
Well, if you asked me this 20 years ago, I would tell you it takes about 2 weeks to get the results back. But because now the software has gotten so much more sophisticated and the algorithms are just that much more accurate, the database that we use, it has over 1 million people in it. It's the second, first, it runs first and second, in the world with the largest amount of data in it. But when we run your individual brainwave patterns and data, we run it through the database system, we almost instantaneously get a report back. So this is a very quick turnaround for providers, for families, or people that are wanting answers quickly, because it's not going to be, we'll get back to you in 2 weeks when the lab gives us back the results. We run the labs or we run the data in-house. So ultimately we can do a brain map. If time permits, we can run the brain map report, and the parent, the family, the athlete, whoever it is, can go home with the brain map report to have a conversation with the family about what's the next step. And we usually provide a very detailed report.
Yeah, your reports are detailed and you make recommendations.
Mhm.
But then you have that report. They choose to go through with the treatment, and you were just explaining on how they watch a show or whatever on the TV, but you set frequencies correct
Right.
on the
Right.
on the equipment that you use, so they can do this at home. Correct. They could either do it in a office or facility, or they could also do it at home, but everything is set up, and then you plug the system into the cap that they're wearing. That's still correct, right?
So when you do the sessions in office, it's not a cap anymore because we've got all the data that we need now in the we'll call it the treatment side of it, the neurofeedback side. Now what we're doing is we're just placing electrodes in the areas we identified. So it can be 2, it could be 4. It depends on how many we want to run simultaneously. But in home or in office, it's a much cleaner, easier thing. The brain map is a little messy because we use gel to kind of make contact with the sensors. In office and in home, it's a pace with a little sensor that just pops on to the scalp, and then you're literally up and running in less than 5 minutes. So very easy to do, very user friendly. We provide videos, and we provide a lot of on-hand support, or just on-site support if we need to with the offices or the people at home that decide to do it in home. That don't have the time to come to the office 2-3 times a week, or driving from a long distance away, or just want to do it in the comfort of their own home. Because especially for the kids, it's easy in an in-home setting because we're implementing screen time because they get to watch any of their preferred,
Yeah, they choose the
they
shows.
choose. Yeah. So Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, any of those platforms that they want to watch, that's fair game. As long as it's obviously appropriate and we're not watching scary movies or things that make you tense, you can watch whatever you want.
And then so it's a 30-minute session, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So you pick your show, everything's set up, and like you were saying, the screen dims if they're losing focus. So they have to really
Right.
Can you over focus like to where you're really trying hard to, do you ever see that to where these
Yeah, so sometimes people try to use their muscles to kind of really squeeze in and get the screen to brighten, but there's we'll call them safeguards that are in place that control for muscle tension. So EMG, with that muscle tension, it dirties up an EEG signal because muscles are 10, 20, 30 times more powerful, 100 times more powerful than muscles. So when we're measuring the brain activity, we're measuring microvolts. So when you're measuring muscles, we're really getting into the millivolt volt range. I mean, for some, it can get really, really powerful. You know a lot about muscles.
Yeah.
They're strong, right? So we want people to be calm and relaxed, and being able to watch. So that way they don't distort the data. So one of the things that's very helpful with people that are dealing with ADHD sometimes is that you have a lot of we'll call them comorbidities, things that get diagnosed along with ADHD, which could be things like anxiety or tension or stress or, elevated, hypertension in people that just have a hard time really kind of calming the nervous system down. The great thing about neurofeedback is that you can't just put a sensor in one spot of the brain and spot pick what you want to fix. If you correct underlying imbalances in some areas that are feeding into that part of the brain, you could be very well addressing a lot of the factors that are related to why you're anxious. As well, why are you anxious about school? Why are you anxious about work? Why are you anxious about putting a ball? So that's a real big thing, because when I work with my professional athletes, ADHD pops up as an afterthought, but really what they're dealing with is anxiety and performance anxiety, which is a big area that sports science is looking at neurofeedback. It got us on the Golf Channel to talk about athletes. So
I watched that episode.
yeah, that was fun. We got to see in real time how neurofeedback has started to infiltrate the sports world, because neurofeedback from a brain perspective is the example I use is pretty simple. I mean, if I'm standing over a ball and I've got a 5-foot putt that I've got to make for, first, second, third place in the tournament, we're talking hundreds of thousands, about millions of dollars in separation. Can you imagine the anxiety that comes with hitting a 5-foot putt that you can hit on any day in your backyard?
Yeah.
But now you put, millions of dollars onto it. So a big thing is, can the brain recover from this mental chatter, or is the mental chatter overtaking our ability to think? And anyone in sports science, knows this, that if you are tense and anxious, your muscles are rigid. And one of the most important things in golf specifically is having your hands loose, having your body relaxed, making sure that your hands are starting at the right time, making sure that your lower body is following. And there's a sequence to it all. But if you're stressed and anxious, everything gets rigid and tight. And now you're seeing people with the yips, and that's in the brain. Sports psychologists talk about it all the time. So this is one of the things that neurofeedback is good at. It's good at finding which parts of the brain are contributing to the problem, because remember, this is a functional assessment of the brain.
So let's dive into the chemical aspect of it. Obviously, I'm a chiropractor. We treat patients non-pharmacologic, and non-medicinal. People come in to see you that are probably taking medications for these conditions, and they don't necessarily want to be taking those.
Right.
So, what are you seeing as far as, you know, how many treatments in would you say is the fastest you would see where a patient's goal is, look, I have anxiety or I have attention deficit disorder, I take these medications, I don't want to take them anymore.
Right.
When they start treatment, what's a really good result like to you as far as the quickest you see where they're starting to notice that, hey, I didn't take my medication today and I feel like I'm focusing a little bit better? Are you seeing like what would that to you ideally, what would that quick
Yeah, so that's a really hard question to answer from a metabolic perspective because first of all, we're dealing with very strong chemicals that are interfering or influencing neurotransmitter levels in some cases, in some aspects, right? Um, so the complexity of that is related to what's going on with the person metabolically to begin with. What are the core problems? Because we talk about like things like chief complaints and things that people come in for. So if there's a list of those things, then neurofeedback starts to whittle those things down to lesser components. Now we're dealing with core issues. And sometimes the core issues end up being that someone from a brainwave perspective can do a lot of neurofeedback and they can make quick progress, but somebody who has a chemical imbalance with neurotransmitter levels that are off, now we're talking about being this far away from what would be considered a normal balanced brain, right? So the complexity of it is that we typically can look at neurofeedback as a starting point, see how the person responds. And I can tell you that to answer your question, people who have a balanced gut, have good neurotransmitter levels, are addressing any DNA methylation pathway issues, have addressed inflammatory markers, have addressed their diet and are not consuming inflammatory foods, or have low, they're not consuming a ton of sugar in their diet, they're not, just eating bad food. You're going to have much quicker progress through neurofeedback because all the missing components that are the foundational basis are already established and in a good place. Some people don't report all these things, so we find out through the neurofeedback process.
It's a process elimination pretty much. So that actually you answered that question perfect, because that's also what I wanted to talk about a little bit, because those are other things that you'll make recommendations of to your patients as far as, you want the treatment to be successful. People are, how do I get better? That's what everybody looks at, right? But you also have these other options. So you have to break down that nutritional aspect and make recommendations potentially.
100%.
And that typically, will you make those recommendations like on your initial reports, just to say, based on the areas of the brain you see in that initial report, you might want to look at this, and this.
Yeah, so
there's a nutritional aspect.
That's great. That's a great question, because a big part of what we do in our intake process is we have questionnaires, and these questionnaires look at physiological aspects of what you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So if we get a brain map, we can match the brain map to physiological conditions and make connections. So we're fortunate in the sense that we've partnered with an amazing nurse practitioner who has years and years of functional health experience. And we have the ability to take a brain map report, look at it, and be able to determine from a cognitive and an emotional perspective how somebody's wired. And a lot of times, in a lot of cases, what we see is that people need a little bit of help because there are connections with EEG activity and inflammation, whole inflammation. So TBI, metabolic encephalopathy, heavy metal toxicity, those things have a mass effect on the brain because they're very inflammatory. And so if someone comes back and they have what we call global delta, which is very globalized slowing to the brain slowed down, is in a kind of like in a self-protect mode, but that delta really is very inhibitory by nature. When we see that usually, just from doing this for as long as I have, I know that I need to talk with a medical personnel or the prescribing doctor of the patient or client that's coming in, and get with that medical professional to have a discussion about things that this person may need to do to get their brain in better balance just from the beginning. So that would include looking at metabolic pathways. That would look at doing, inflammatory markers, looking at interleukin 6, looking at homocysteine levels, looking at inflammatory cytokines. These are all things that have an effect on the brain. So if we don't address those things, and a lot of times it's coming from the gut because of people's diets, and a big thing is our food supply and things that we're used to eating. We put tons and tons of things into our foods to preserve them and to make them shelf stable, that it's causing mass effects. And you see it all over the news. You see foods now will have things like no MSG or non-GMO or no fluoride. Those things are things that we know over time, have learned enough about them with these single dose toxicity levels that you can consume it once and it's not going to kill you. But I don't know,
repetitively over and over and over again.
I don't know too many people that have died from smoking one cigarette either.
Yeah.
So
correct.
Yeah.
No, that answers that question, but going further into that, you'll have people that are at least can figure out whether or not they get benefit from the treatment,
right.
and if they change their diet, and then if they go back to their bad habits, just like anything else, just like weight loss or whatever,
Right.
they can at least tell and say, I was getting better from a standpoint. I changed my diet, and now all of a sudden I'm eating bad again. So this problem is coming back. This ADD issue is coming back. But from a standpoint of your professional athletes, I mean, from what you've seen and treated, are they on a pretty regimented? Are they a little bit easier to treat just from an aspect of their diets are better? Do you notice that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that top tier athletes. I mean, I was lucky enough to work a while back with Michael Campbell, who won the 2005 U.S. Open, and I mean, we got into a lot of conversations. Michael's such an amazing guy. He'll tell you his life story. He's such a approachable person. After winning the U.S. Open, he had he really, the success of it all was a lot for anybody, right? So over time, you reach the pinnacle, and then that pinnacle it's hard to stay on that mountaintop, right? Considering that in that 2005 U.S. Open, Tiger Woods was on his tail, so he beat Tiger in that U.S. Open. The amount of pressure that he had at that time to sustain that for long periods of time, athletes have to maintain rigorous diets, rigorous exercise, schedules, and all those things are certainly in place. And we definitely talked about those things. Michael's always been in great shape. But diet and influence in those things, like if you slip off your diet, if you're an athlete and you go out on a night and you have a lot of drinks or something along those lines, all that's inflammatory and can offset that whole process. So diet, nutrition, all those things, like we see that athletes, yes, are much better at being good about those things. So because we don't see 100% of our clients are athletes, it's a big part of our assessment is understanding what is in your pantry, what are you eating, what is your lifestyle like, what's your stress like? Because we know too that if your stress levels are high and you're eating carbohydrates, those carbohydrates get stored to fat much quicker if your cortisol levels are high. So stress markers are indicators of things that we look at in our assessments and evaluations. And then compare that and contrast it. Like I said at the beginning, this is differential diagnosis. So this isn't diagnosing you formally, but it's taking patterns in the brain that we know that equate to conditions that that are typically found in diagnoses or symptomologies of different diagnoses.
So I would imagine with children, teenagers, I mean, you're going to see probably not as great of diets,
That's it.
With that, it's probably a little bit more challenging. So the parent has to be very focused on, hey,
Right.
This is what you need to do if you really want this to work. Do you get a lot of compliance when it comes to that? Like, do the parents, are they compliant? Because a lot of these kids are, hard to work with as it is, because they're dealing with this condition.
Yeah.
Do the parents typically comply with you, or do they, is that a big challenge of what you have?
I think just because of the nature of what we do, being that something that is not in the mainstream of medicine, a lot of the families and people that are coming to us have tried the medication route, have tried, doing self-help with diets and whatnot, but now they've come to us because they need a bit more help. And so they're much more open. A lot of people are really open to neurofeedback and the idea of it. It's no longer a theory. It's something that's been shown in evidence through double-blind controlled studies, meta-analyses of 16 different studies showing that neurofeedback is as effective as a medication. Now, this wasn't something that I came up with on my own. This was actually published a while back. And for a while, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommended neurofeedback as a stage one, tier one intervention, along with medication therapy, because these double-blind control studies, these meta-analyses showed that the brain can make the dynamic changes that it needs to make in order to be able to focus and concentrate, which is why it's best known in that arena, in that area of health. ADHD and ADD are the things that neurofeedback is best known for to help address. So, the nutrition component of it is not as well known from an ADD perspective, but we're hearing it. The red food dyes, things that folic acid, anything that's enriched flour or fortified and whatnot. The big thing, and you'll hear some people on some pretty well-known podcasts talk about this, but I believe that the number somewhere around 44% of the human population has a gene mutation to the MTHFR gene. That's the methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase gene. And what that does is it takes things like folic acid and converts it over into methylfolate, which is the usable form of that particular substance. So we get folate in our diet and we convert it to methylfolate. You can also convert folic acid into methylfolate. But if you have that MTHFR gene and there's a single or double expression, or both parents have it or one parent has it, it can complicate that conversion. And now you have someone who is, consuming things like folic acid, and they're not able to convert it into methylfolate and folic acid. It'll rev your brain up to no end.
So do you have to do blood work to find out if the person has that gene?
We do DNA cheek swabs. So that's part of our intake process with a lot of families is we want to know, again, functional tests, right? What does that gene do? What is the function of that gene from a methylation perspective? And is it able to convert or to downregulate or to change or to methylate certain things? So people with anxiety, a big thing with anxiety is that you have these specific levels of different neurotransmitters that are broken down by some of these methylation genes. And if that defect is there, well, then you're always hopped up and your elevations of these catecholamine levels are always high because you're not breaking them down at night, and you're up at night and your mind's chattering, can't fall asleep. You wake up the next day, your mind's racing. Those are all things that our body experiences, but our mind experiences them even if we're just thinking about it. So you could think about, falling off of a bike, or you could physically fall off a bike, and the same metabolic pathways gets activated in the brain because the brain doesn't know the difference between something physical that's happening or something that you imagine, which is why visual imagery in golf and other sports is super important, that an athlete can focus long enough to where they can imagine ball flight and imagine trajectory. Because if you can't shut off that chatter, then you can't focus in long enough in a linear pathway to get from imagination to execution. So, all these things are related to those DNA pathways, because breaking down catecholamines, even things like inflammation, homocysteine being changed down or converted into methionine, that's a very important thing for people that are dealing with stress, anxiety, even people with cardiovascular issues. Breaking down homocysteine is one of the most important things that we're finding out is related to blood pressure. So, there's so many different things that the genes do, but from our perspective, we focus on the brain and what neurotransmitters are being affected because of absorption issues through organic acids testing. And so we kind of run the gambit of everything from the brain map, assessing the electrical activity, the neurotransmitter testing, looking at neurotransmitter levels, organic acids test to look and see if you're even absorbing it, or if you have things like inflammation from like fungus or yeast. Those specific things like candida can block the absorption of phenylalanine and tyrosine, which, guess what? Those two things specifically make up, through a long chain of conversions, our dopamine, our epinephrine, our norepinephrine. And then so, knowing from a functional perspective what somebody's gut, their brain at the DNA level and at the EEG or brainwave activity level, I think is why our program really, it just really covers the full basis of all these different things that we're talking about.
Well, the amazing thing is, like, you read about it or you hear about it, or people that watch these videos, they might look at, neurofeedback sounds great. That seems easy. I'll sit in front of a TV and I'll watch, but I mean, look what else goes on in the body. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what people have to understand, is that what we put into our bodies and how we take care of ourselves and the maintenance aspect of the body is so important. The phones have got to be creating a problem now. I mean, these kids, they're on their phones all the time. They're being overstimulated. They're
Oh,
up late at night, like you
yeah.
said. So I mean,
Dopamine. I mean, all the main things that you see there is all that. Why do they make blue light blockers for people? Because all that intense blue light can offset circadian rhythms. It can affect
Mhm.
your production of melatonin and your vitamin D production. All these things are mitigated by where the sun is in the sky. My mentor, Dr. Richard Suter, who's one of the pioneers in the field of neurofeedback, said that our biggest blunder was the invention of the light bulb, because that really changed our ability to, at nighttime, back, long time ago, sunset, it was time to go get inside and time to wind down because there was no light to be found. And now, I mean, I was just talking to someone about Times Square, how bright is it down there that, it's like
All the time.
all
Like
the time.
it's
So
never not daytime at Times Square.
no. So yeah. So the lights are a big thing, and yeah, I mean, I think the data eventually will reveal itself that there's an over activation of these, and to your point, we are seeing a lot higher levels of adrenal fatigue in children.
Yeah.
Because adrenal fatigue is how often are these adrenal glands being activated with catecholamines. You have the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, which is our fight or flight system. Well, guess what? You're watching a lot of exciting things at night instead of going to bed. You're going to get that fight or flight system up. And now we're talking about stages and levels of adrenal fatigue where you're excited all the time. Well, guess what? Now you've got to have your compensatory neurotransmitters like serotonin and GABA. They got to rise up to meet that level. And over time, what happens is you deplete them all. You can't, unless you're putting in the right substrates to make neurotransmitters, you're not replenishing that storage. You're depleting everything. Now you're in adrenal fatigue. And how many people have been talking about adrenal fatigue for the last 10 years? And we see it more and more and more, and even younger kids. So it's getting interesting.
I've known Adrian quite a few years, and he's definitely becoming smarter as time goes on. It's very impressive. Every time I talk to him, it's just, there's an overwhelming amount of information. Not overwhelming, but it's an abundant amount of information.
Yeah,
So
it's a lot.
I'm very impressed, man. I'm happy for you. I think
Yeah.
you guys are on an awesome track. His website is neurologics.com. That's neurologix.com. And he is even willing to share his phone number if anybody has any questions or wants more information. I mean, once again, he's got a lot of knowledge. He's got a lot of years behind his belt in this field. I'll allow you to go ahead and give your number out if you'd like to anybody that would like to reach out to Adrian.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
So my phone number is 407-963-6400. We have people that will answer the call or they'll forward it to us. And so I'm happy to talk about this. If you're a provider, you're an athlete, or you're a parent that has struggled with anything related to the ADHD spectrum, even autism spectrum, these are the things that we do on a day-to-day basis. So I'm always happy to talk about it. Feel free to reach out. You can also email us at hello@neurologix.com. So hello@neurologix.com.
Adrian, I greatly appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I mean, this is just one aspect of the things we're trying to do with this show and what we're trying to get out there and, spread the good word on how people can be taken care of. I mean, that's what Let's Talk Health is all about. And as I always say, we're trying to, to bridge that gap between the alternative side and the traditional medical side. But, we'll continue to have people on and provide as best information as we can and informative videos for everybody. And as we continue to try to do the right thing to take care of our patients and take care of everybody out there. So that wraps up this week's show. I'm Dr. Dan Pavlik. This is the Let's Talk Health Forum, and we are sponsored by the Access Health and Wellness Association. And we look forward to seeing you next time.